but the number of participants is raising up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We will give everyone a couple minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, just to start coming in, and then we will begin, just to be respectful of everyone's time as well. Good afternoon to those of us joining right now. Welcome. We're going to start in about a minute or two, so we'll begin shortly. But just to be respectful of everyone's time, we will start in 1 minute just to give a few more people to join and sign in. Perfect, let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program. If this is your first time at our events, we welcome you and hope you go visit our website so you can stay informed of our upcoming events that we have for the rest of the semester. My name is Bora, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. A little bit about how today is going to go. I will introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our speaker. After our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderator discussion followed by Q&A. So we ask to please enter your questions in the Q&A so our moderator can look through them during the portion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jim Hollifield. He is the Academic Director of the Tower Center. So Jim, I will now turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bora. And since we're on a very tight timeline, we're going to move quickly here. But let me just reiterate Bora's welcome and introduction. We're glad to have you here for the Tower Center, the Texas-Mexico Center. And most of you know, or maybe some of you don't know, that this lecture is actually sponsored and paid for by the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at SMU and in North Texas. And since my colleague, Professor Caroline Britell, with whom I have worked for 20 some years already, she was one of the instigators of this program. She knows Professor Massey very well. So I wanted to ask Professor Britell to say something about the origin of this lecture, and then I will formally introduce our speaker. Caroline.
Well, welcome everybody. Professor Massey comes to us as a visiting scholar under the Visiting Scholars Program of Phi Beta Kappa, which apparently over the last 63 years has sponsored 720 visiting scholars who've made 5,500 visits to various campuses around the country, to places that have Phi Beta Kappa sheltering institutions. The SMU chapter Phi Beta Kappa was launched in 1949. The first person inducted was our president, Humphrey Lee. And if there are students present, they know who Humphrey Lee is because there's a building named after him. So the goal of this program is to contribute to the intellectual life of the university and to facilitate the exchange of ideas. So we're very happy to welcome Professor Massey as this year's Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar. Thank you.
Okay, well, I can segue quickly from Professor Britell to Professor Massey. I'm happy to say that both of them are members of the National Academy of Science. So that's a very prestigious thing to be part of. And I know it's a complete cliche, but for once I can say we have a scholar here who literally needs no introduction. I mean, he is known far and wide, especially for his work on migration, a very distinguished sociologist and demographer. I was looking over the brief bio that we have on our website here, and the first thing that hit me is he doesn't just write about migration. He writes very broadly about issues of race, discrimination, and housing. At least the books that he put out front there were things like American Apartheid and Climbing Mount Laurel, The Struggle for Affordable Housing, The Source of the River, which is an analysis of minority achievement in colleges and universities, Taming the River. I could go on, but we know him mostly for his work on migration. Many of you out there in the audience have probably used his surveys, the surveys that he helped to build on the migration, the National Immigrant Survey, the Latin American Migration Project, and so forth and so on. He's a professor at Princeton University. He started his career at the University of Chicago, if they have any Chicagoans out there. I knew him when he was at the University of Pennsylvania for many years. I think he's actually come back home to Princeton, where he originally did his degree. He's a member, in addition to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he's also a member of the American Philosophical Society and the past president of the American Sociological Association and of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. So that was perhaps a bit too long, but now we're very eager to hear from Professor Massey. He has about 20 minutes or so, and we're going to have lots of Q&A. I know this is a very uncontroversial subject, and that there probably won't be much back and forth, but Professor Massey, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be at SMU, if only online, but we all do our best to adapt to the circumstances. I've been studying migration across the Mexico-US border since 1978, and a lot of things have changed since 1978. And at this juncture, we're at a really hinge point in the transformation of what's the traffic across the Mexico-US border. And we have a new reality that really hasn't sunk into a lot of people yet. First thing we need to know about the new reality is that undocumented migration from Mexico is basically over, and it's probably not coming back. A couple of reasons to say this. First, it's not because of border enforcement. That was never a very powerful deterrent for people coming to the United States. Paradoxically, it deterred them from going home once they'd crossed the border, but that's another story. The reason that migration finally came to an end was because of the demographic transition in Mexico. In 1970, the fertility rate in Mexico was about 6.8 children per woman. Today, it's 2.1 children per woman, which is below replacement level. And Mexico, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, became an aging society. And the average age rose from about 17 or 18 in 1970s to today it's 29. And labor migration is very age dependent. People start migrating for work in their late teens. The out-migration rates peak around 22 or 23 years old, and then they decline pretty rapidly and beyond age 30. If you haven't started migrating then, you're not going to start for the most part, at least for labor migration. So Mexico basically aged out of the migrant-prone years. And the other reason is that quietly, without anyone making much of a fuss about it or even really noticing quietly, we've expanded guest worker migration from Mexico to record levels. In 2019, there were almost 900,000 entries from Mexico on temporary work visas of one sort or another. And probably most people are familiar with the H-1A visa, which is the most common used among Mexicans, and probably very common in Texas because it's an agricultural work visa. But that's not the only one. There are a variety of visas that have come into play as the economic integration between Mexico and the United States deepened under the North American Free Trade Agreement, one of which is the TN visa, the temporary Nafta visa. And they're giving about 50,000 of those visas out every year. And unlike a lot of the temporary work visas, these don't have a numerical limit, and they can be renewed ad infinitum. So there are a lot of TN visas that accumulate over time. Basically, Mexican migration started to decline around the year 2000, and then it ended definitively with the onset of the Great Recession in 2008. And since 2008, it's been net negative, and the net negativeness has been accelerating over time, and the Mexican portion of the undocumented population has been steadily shrinking. And in 2019, it was a record low share of people apprehended along the border were from Mexico. Now, that's a big transformation. And what's replaced Mexican migration, not even really replaced it, what's become evident with the disappearance of Mexicans from the border is the presence of Central Americans. And they've been there for a long time, been coming in the hundreds of thousands for every 5 years. Several hundred thousand have appeared along the border and come into the United States or been apprehended. And this is a direct result of our intervention in Central America during the Cold War. In 1980, the Reagan administration was elected, came into office in 81, pledged to pursue vigorously the Cold War and the defeat of what he called the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And target number one was the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, which had overthrown what LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, called our bastard, the Somoza regime. And it was a leftist regime that took over. And this was intolerable for the people who came into the White House and the Reagan administration. And they launched a massive intervention, providing paramilitary support, logistics support, monetary support for paramilitary operations in El Salvador and Guatemala to pursue the ground level insurgency there. And then ultimately financing an entire army called the Contra Army that was based in Honduras in an attempt to invade Nicaragua and depose the Sandinista regime. And the positioning of the Contra Army in Honduras helped to disrupt that country. It involved a lot of bribery payments to political leaders there to have them turn their head and not say anything. And it really instituted a lot of violence and corruption in Honduras, which was not exactly an uncorrupt place to begin with. So basically what happened in the 1980s is this intervention unleashed waves of violence that displaced people from the countryside and even from cities. And the violence had the side effect of pretty much destroying the economy. The GDP per capita in what I call the frontline nations of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the GDP per capita fell after 1980 in real terms and bottomed out in the 1990s. And you didn't even get back to the pre-Sandinista level of GDP per capita in those three countries until 2011. And this opened up a permanent wide gap between those three countries and Nicaragua as well, and the rest of Central America, and indeed the rest of the Americas. And the violence also stopped a bit when the civil war stopped, but the violence became endemic in the region. And the murder rate in Central American countries has been among the highest in the world for the past 2 or 3 decades. We only pick up homicide statistics in 1990, but the homicide rate is 2 or 3 times the level in neighboring countries and much higher than the United States. So what happened after the intervention is that it never returned to the status quo ante. And violence was inculcated into the region, and economic degradation became a permanent part of the scene. And then the United States inadvertently amplified the violence because of our deportation programs. So in the 1990s, we began to launch mass deportations from the United States in the name of the war on terror. So before 1996, there were never more than about 50,000 deportations per year from the United States, and usually much lower than that if you go back farther. After 1996, when we passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, deportations from the interior of the United States skyrocket. Then after 2001, the passage of the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11, with virtually no debate and no reading of the actual bill, deportations were on steroids and went through the roof. And by the Obama administration, we're deporting 450,000 people per year during the first Obama administration. And these deportations were launched in the name of the war on terror. But the people who suffered the deportations were Latino migrants from Latin America, overwhelmingly from Mexico and Central America. So to show Al Qaeda how serious we were about prosecuting the war on terror, we deported our Latinos. And very few people have been deported to actual terrorist sending countries. So the people arriving at the border and they are arriving in family groups instead of as single adults, and a rising presence of unaccompanied minors. And what has really happened, the big picture is what had been this massive flow of adult workers coming into the United States from Mexico year after year has disappeared. And it's been replaced by a much smaller flow of families and children coming into the United States, not to seek a job, but to seek refuge. And so what had been a large labor migration has now become a much smaller, but more needy humanitarian migration. And the problem at the border has been that the United States wasn't prepared to accept all these asylum seekers who were fleeing conditions that really dated from our own intervention and had a lot to do with our own intervention. And we are capable of managing a large refugee flow. From 1978 to 1998, we took in 1.3 million Southeast Asian boat people and settled them in the United States and set them on their way. And they are now a fairly integrated and successful part of the United States fabric. But we've just chosen to ignore the fact that we have a large burden of moral responsibility for what's happened in Central America. And the Trump administration came in and refused to take asylum applications. Migrants had gotten used to coming to the border region, crossing at a border crossing and going up to an inspection station. And instead of trying to get in illicitly, they just say, "I'm here to claim asylum." And under US law, they're supposed to be taken in and have a hearing to adjudicate their asylum claim. But the Trump administration was just throwing them back in Mexico. So camps in Mexico on the Mexican side started to grow. Conditions deteriorated. And of course, people got desperate. And many of them, after a while, decided to cross into the United States illegally. Not to escape capture on the other side, but actually to look for a Border Patrol officer so they could turn themselves in and then claim defensive asylum. If you claim it as you're on at a port of order, it's called affirmative asylum. If you claim it after you've been in the United States without documents, then it's defensive asylum. But it's asylum nonetheless, and that forces them to at least put on a show of hearing the asylum plea. Now, the problem is that they're being put into a detention system that was never built to house families and children over the long term. The detention system, which is 2/3 privately run by two corporations, was basically constructed in order to process largely male Mexican workers quickly. They would be arrested. The migrant workers from Mexico cross the border, try to evade capture. If they are unfortunate and got captured, then they would sign a voluntary departure order and be put back into Mexico at the earliest possible opportunity. So you're housing men for a day or overnight or a day or two the most. And now people are crossing in and they don't want to evade capture. They're looking to get captured so that they can make their asylum claim. And then all these women and children and families end up in a detention system that was never built to hold people like them. And they're just overwhelmed. And you've seen the pictures in the magazines of kids behind cyclone fences and in jails. And we don't really know what's going on in that system because it's private and it's hard to get access to a lot of the detention centers. So basically, now a new administration's come into office, the Biden administration. And Biden, I think, is trying to undo many of the restrictions that the Trump administration put on. But there's a big backlog of people wanting asylum cases to be heard, and there's a pent-up demand for them. And a surge at the border was almost inevitable unless if Biden was elected. And of course, rumors are fanned by people traffickers that to tell people that, oh, it's easy to go to the United States and you can get asylum, and they're willing to believe it because they're desperate. So it's really a humanitarian disaster, a humanitarian crisis at the border, not really a migration crisis in the same way that Mexican immigration was portrayed as a migration crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. We could probably deal with it if we obeyed our own laws and processed these people. And if we could find a pathway to legalization for the 11 million people out of status, many of those are family members of the people coming to the border now. And there's no way to really reunify families if the family in the United States is undocumented. But if they could be given legal status, many of these people could be processed as many of the people coming to the border now could be processed as asylum seekers and given out to their family members who would take care of them and save a public burden. So that's really the situation at the border now. The numbers, they seem large, but that's largely because of the backlog. The numbers, if you look at the longer trends, the numbers are really in the tens of thousands coming in per year, not the hundreds of thousands coming in per year. And I think that if Biden can maneuver some immigration reform to get a legalization program going, and is successful in restoring the amnesty program, not the amnesty program, the asylum program that was part of U.S. Immigration law and practice before Trump, I think that we can go a long way to solving the problem at the border.
It looks like you've reached the end of your presentation, Doug, so we can now open it up for questions, but we're going to take the prerogative, if you don't mind, of being the moderators, and I may go back and forth a little bit with Caroline and me, but I've already written down about 6 questions that I want to ask you. I sort of wanted to start with one of the great conundrums in the study of migration. I think you have heard about the famous migration hump. Which means when we try to develop as a society or an economy, bringing more trade and investment, this can provoke a big rural exodus from the country, and it actually stimulates migration. I think our colleague Phil Martin and others documented that with respect to U.S.-Mexico, and Nafta itself actually stimulated a lot of extra migration. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about the migration hump. And just to build on that for a second, you say Mexican migration is finished, basically. Is there anything that might start it back up again?
I didn't say that Mexican migration was finished. I said that undocumented migration was finished. And the other thing that happened was we opened a wide door for temporary labor migrants. And that is satisfying a lot of the demand that used to be met by undocumented migrants. But the demographic forces that produce migration are no longer at play. So yeah, I think it's pretty much done. And if you look at total numbers in net terms, there's a big circulation, legal circulation in and out, but there's not that much settlement. So the Mexican population is actually growing, is not really growing, it's shrinking. So anyway, about the migration hump, I think Mexico has gone through it. They've made the passage. And if you look at the 3 countries in Central America that are the prime centers of migrants, they're not nearly as developed as Mexico, and they've got lots of problems. But in terms of the demographic transition, which is a part of the story, El Salvador is already below replacement fertility. It's only a 5 million person population. Honduras is rapidly approaching replacement level fertility, and it's about 8 million people or something. And Guatemala is bigger and has higher fertility, but it's also coming down rapidly. So I don't think the demographic potential is there for a real long-term process of migration and settlement. There will be a hump even in those countries in the not too distant future.
Let me build on that, then I want to turn it over to Caroline and let her pose a question. But what do we know about the Central Americans who are coming to the border now in terms of the socio-demographics, the drivers of what's bringing people to the border? They tend to be young. Many of them are children being sent there. And I think you have pointed out that many of them have family members, often parents who are living in the U.S. So I think we forget about the family dimension of all this. Could you say more about who these people are and what's driving them to the border?
Well, when the displacements occurred in the 1980s, and we suddenly got large populations of Central Americans living north of the border, many in undocumented status, not quite a number also on temporary protected status, that created an anchor for networks, migration networks that extend back to Central America. We got about 2.5, 3 million Central Americans in the United States, and they've got relatives in these countries. And when things go bad, people draw on their network ties to their friends and relatives and seek entry into the United States, and then shelter and jobs or accommodation with their family members. They're mostly escaping threats to their well-being. They're not coming for a better life. They're really coming in order to have a life, to save a life. The conditions are quite dangerous, especially for young people. Young women are preyed upon for sexual trafficking, and young men are preyed upon to be forced into gangs, where we start them out as lookouts in something simple and then work them into the gang structure over time. And as I said, the gangs, maybe I didn't say it here, forget what I say where, but the gangs really are an export from the United States. So the feared Mara Salvatrucha y Calle 18, they were founded in the Pico Union neighborhood of Los Angeles. And that's because it was part of blowback from our intercession in the region. We displaced all these people. The Salvadorans arrived in Los Angeles, and they didn't have any prior networks, no connections, no social organization. They had a hard time integrating. It was dominated by Mexicans, Mexican organization, Mexican networks. So especially young men had a hard time getting into jobs, and they were too old to really adjust into the school system, and they ended up on the streets. And then they were preyed upon by the Bloods and the Crips, black gangs from LA, and they formed their own gangs in self-defense. And that was fine, I suppose, for a while. But then when the deportation started in 1996, that's when we started deporting all these people back and transmitted the gangs into Central America, where they organized there and became a more powerful force there.
What years was that when we started that deportation?
1996 is the key year. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act was passed, and it shoots up. And then 2001 Patriot Act, and we've cumulatively deported something like 140, 150,000 criminal aliens back into Central Americans who attained their criminality in the United States because they were a marginal population that had nowhere to go when they got here.
Caroline, why don't you ask a couple of questions, and I will look at the Q&A while you do that.
Yeah, and I see we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, and there's one in the chat. But so I had a two-part question. One was, obviously, President Biden has recently announced that he's going to be sending Vice President Harris with a delegation down to Central America, which sounds to me like this is the first time that, but correct me if I'm wrong, that an administration has thought about actually going to the sending areas and talking with people about it. But I wonder, so it's what you think about that as an initial strategy of the moment, and then how, given this significant change that you're describing, what would you say should be the 4 or 5 elements of a comprehensive immigration reform?
Well, I think it's an important signal to the world and to the immigrant community and to citizens in the United States when they send the vice president down, who's a daughter of immigrants. So she has moral standing to come down and talk to other people who are involved in the process of immigration. In fact, find out what's really going on in these sending countries and come back and report it, and then base policies on a better understanding of what's going on in the sending communities, in the sending regions. In addition to the violence and the economic degradation that's there, we now have the whole situation being complicated by climate change. And Central America turns out to be a very vulnerable area for climate change and extreme weather events. We had hurricanes last year that were devastating in Honduras, and that's another reason that people were trying to escape. And then there's droughts. So the coffee harvests have been poor in Guatemala and Honduras. So I think that it's a good sign, and I'm waiting to see what comes of it, of course, but I think that that's a good step in the right direction. In terms of what I think should be done, the 2 biggest things are finding a pathway to legal status for the 11 million people who are here and have no criminal record, because then you'll have legal inhabitants of the United States who will be able to care for and support and take care of family members who come to claim asylum. And they'll have a pathway for integration into American society. And then I think we need to revive and expand the asylum system to hear people's stories and make the adjudications and reunite families when it seems in order and possible. Those are the two basic things. One thing that used to be talked about was, oh, we should get a guest worker program. Well, we've already got the guest worker program. Nobody noticed, but we do. We're giving out 300 to 350,000 visas for temporary work every year, and that's producing hundreds of thousands more of entries with people going back and forth.
Caroline, I'm going to try to take three at a time. So I'll do the first three and fold them together. If you want to look at the next three with Nicholas,
Okay.
your colleague, Nicholas Sternthorpe.
Yeah.
But the first three questions are all about Central America, Doug. And one of them wants to know, how do the kids make a 1,000-mile journey to the U.S. border? Are they walking this far? Who is supporting this? The next question asks, what about the Central American Minors Program? What do you think about that program? And the third question, very much related, is why don't the Central Americans stay in Mexico? Is it unsafe for them to stay in Mexico? So could you do those three, and then I'll let Caroline take the next three. How about that?
Okay. So what was the first part of the question? I forget.
Well, the first question was, how do they get here? I mean,
okay.
1,000 miles is a long way.
They come in a variety of different ways. For a while, they were riding the trains up north, but they stopped that more or less. Now, sometimes smugglers will organize these caravans, and people are afraid to cross Mexico on foot or on bus because it's dangerous and it can be preyed upon. And so whenever a caravan gets organized, people flock to it because there's safety in numbers. Yep. And then they oftentimes walk along for a good part of the way. There's buses, and then smugglers provide some transportation, but that costs more than most people can afford. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a catch as catch can thing, that these caravans emerge, and then people pile on, and then they hope for the best because they're crossing in numbers. And why don't they stay in Mexico? Well, the president of Mexico, Amlo, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, initially invited them in and said, you're welcome to come into Mexico. And then they came in, and they came in larger numbers than he expected, and then he reversed himself, and he armed a new kind of paramilitary force, the Guardia Nacional, to harass the migrants as they're coming in and crossing into Mexico and staying on the Mexican side of the border, waiting for an opportunity to come in. And so Mexico, even though Mexico is a migrant sending country, and huge fraction of Mexicans have a relative living in the United States, and a long migratory tradition, they're not very sympathetic to other migrants coming in. It's kind of like the American story, where your grandparents were the good immigrants, and the ones coming across now, they're the bad immigrants. They're not as good as my grandparents were. And the Central Americans are not being treated very well and are being ostracized. And then of course they're demonized as violent and gang members as well. So Mexico is not a very attractive place for them to be.
Caroline, you want to take a few of them here? We've got Nicholas and Hiroki and.
Yes, no, I see them. So I think Nico's question Doug addressed in answering my question. If that's not correct, Nico, you can pose it again. But so going on to another question from Hiroki Takeuchi, who's a professor of political science. He asked, would going back to the policies of the Obama period be sufficient to, to solve the current humanitarian emergency by clearing the backlog? In other words, in the next few months, would the current quote, quote, crisis be solved?
I think it could be solved in the next year, at least controlled and ordered. Going back to Obama is not the solution, because the Obama era was far from perfect. And I complained about Trump, but if you look at the data and the history, the militarization of the border and the mass deportation was a bipartisan operation. It was supported by the Democrats. So this has been a bipartisan problem. The Democrats were not the leaders on these things, but they acquiesced and bought into the rhetoric of the border being this terrible place that's a terrible line of defense that we need to defend at all costs for all the hostile elements south of it. So I think granting legal status to 11 million people would make most of what the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Force does irrelevant. They don't need the size of the force that we've got now, either on the border or in the internal part of the country, to police a border where there are very few people coming in compared to historical levels, looking for undocumented crossing, and very few, if people are legalized and living in the United States, the force is much too big to really effectively combat terrorism and other criminal activities. Most of their job is taking up harassing regular families and deporting families, and the deportation regime is very dysfunctional for the United States at this point, because since Mexican migration, undocumented migration stopped in 2008, the people that are living here now, and Central Americans as well, have been here for 15 or 20 years. And the large majority of households headed by undocumented migrants or containing undocumented migrants have multiple US-born citizen children. So when you deport a parent, you're really harming a significant chunk of the next generation of the United States. And the deportation of a parent is extremely traumatic in the well-being of children. And I just don't see any moral equation where the harm that's being done to US citizen kids is balanced out by being in an authorized status and having no criminal record, but just being present without authorization. And it's a very harsh punishment for what was essentially a civil infraction, not a criminal infraction. And it's not doing us any good. It's not solving the problem, and it's harming the next generation. There are an estimated 600,000 US-born children in Mexico with their deported parents now who are not doing well. They don't speak Spanish that well. They don't understand Mexico. They look Mexicans, but they don't act like Mexicans, and they get bullied. And they're not fitting into the school system. Mm-hmm. So, and these people are going to return to the United States someday because they're US-born citizens, and they're not going to have the education they would have had. They're not going to have the healthcare they would have had, and they're probably going to be traumatized and angry. And we're kind of denigrating our own human capital by running these deportation programs at this point. It's overkill for what the problem is.
Let me, I will take the next three, and then Caroline, you look at the three after that if you want.
Okay.
If we look at, someone wants to know if the Biden policies are causing these people to come to the border. And that is, the classic moral hazard question. You open the door a little bit, you try to take care of the people who are there, and then many more people rush to the border. Someone wants you to speak to that issue. There's also a question, again, about the cartels in Mexico. What role are they playing in all of this? And finally, again, a question about whether the Central American, the kids who are coming, do they really have a lot of family members here? Do we have any idea how many of them have family members? So those are the next three questions.
The last part of that is we don't know a lot about these kids, and we don't know a lot about the Mexican Migration Project, which I've run with my colleague Jorge Durand in Mexico for 30 years. We're retiring. We're trying to pass it on to our students, David Lindstrom, who's a professor at Brown, and Silvia Girguli, who's president of the Colegio de Mexico. And their vision for the future of the Mexican Migration Project, it'll still be the MMP, but they're going to call it the Mesoamerican Migration Project, and expand data gathering operations into Central America so we can get a better handle on that. We did gather data in Central America as part of the Latin American Migration Project, but our surveys are fairly dated at this point, and we haven't gone back. And so I think you need a continuous kind of data monitoring like we set up in Mexico to really understand the dynamics of what's happening. And I know that there's a research team based at the Colegio de Mexico putting in for funding to set up a program to identify all these American citizen kids and find out about them and what's happening to them in Mexico. And with all that said, I forgot the first two questions.
The one about moral hazard, is the Biden policy causing this surge?
Yes and no. There's a huge pent-up demand because we haven't been taking applications for a long time. So word gets out that applications are being taken, there's a surge. And then the surge is fanned by self-interested parties, smugglers who want to make money by luring people at high cost to come north to the border when there's not much of a chance of them getting processed in the near future. But I think those things will play themselves out. And if you look at the effect of the IRCA's amnesty, the Immigration Reform and Control Act that was passed in 1986, a couple million Mexicans legalized through that, and there was say, oh, this will just encourage further migration in the United States. But within 3 years, 2 or 3 years, basically it returned to the status quo ante. There's no acceleration. And then what caused the growth of the undocumented population in the 1990s was our own militarization of the border, which made border crossing so risky and costly that people minimized border crossing by staying longer in the US and then do a settlement process. Mm-hmm. And then Mexican migration stopped of its own accord it went over the demographic bump, and it stopped of its own accord. And so I think that there's evidence that these things, usually when you apply force to something that's happening, it backfires on you.
And there was a question about the cartels, and if I could just piggyback on that, what is the motivation of the Amlo administration to cooperate with the U.S. in all this and become to do the dirty work for the Americans and stopping the Central Americans? Could you comment on that?
Well, Amlo's a student of Mexican and American history, and he knows it's not a good idea to antagonize the giant to the north. He initially, he's a man of the people, right, and a populist. And so he initially welcomed their brethren from Central America, but then he got pushback from the Trump administration and threats, and so he retreated pretty quickly. And he might change under Biden. It's hard to figure out Amlo. He's a strange bird, and he hasn't been consistent in his policies. They vary from time to time and place to place. He's done a bad job with COVID, I think, and then the cartels, big problem in Mexico. The real damage goes back to the presidency of Calderon. When he came into office, I think his equation was he was going to curry favor with the Americans by launching a real massive war on drugs, the big show of it. And you take out the top of a bunch of gangs, and then they splinter into factions and they fight each other. And it just took what was kind of a controlled flow of drugs and turned it into an ongoing battle and made violence a part and parcel of a lot of parts of Mexican life. It's very uneven geographically. There are places that are very safe and other places that are very dangerous. But Mexico's changed a great deal since I was there. And I was interested in what role violence has in predicting migration. And so I used data from the Mexican Migration Project and estimated some models. And what we found was that violence affects migration, but it has a negative effect on migration in the United States and a positive effect on internal migration in Mexico. So people move out of rural areas, which are now dangerous, and go into cities, which are less dangerous, ironically. And the most dangerous places are like rural Guanajuato, and rural Michoacan, and rural Jalisco. And you're safer in Guadalajara or Mexico City or
my friend Saira Alcazar, she wanted to know about the Central American Miners Program. She asked again.
I don't really know much about it, to be perfectly honest. You'd have to explain it to me.
Yeah, well, maybe Sarah can put something in the box about it, and we'll come back to it. Caroline, you want to?
Yeah. So I wanted. As a follow-up question to what you were, when I asked the question, I think about Vice President Harris. Somebody wants to know, and then I'm going to tag on a second question to it. Would supporting enhancing economic development of Central American countries be the policies for the United States to take? That is assisting, for example, to build the environment, promoting foreign direct investment. And then related to a second question. I think was your comment about the fact that some of these countries were suffering from severe climate change and whether that really should be a reason for asylum. I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do think that climate change is going to globally create a lot of refugee populations, and maybe that's what you're trying to suggest, but I will let you answer the question.
Well, I think that is definitely going to happen, and we're seeing it already.
Mhm.
And I think that the climate effects have exacerbated the flow that already existed for the reasons I already stated. So so-called climate refugees are not technically refugees under the UN Convention.
Right.
And so they have to come in as asylum seekers, and then it gets down to U.S. policies and U.S. laws. There's not, but I think there's going to be increasing demands for this sort of shelter from climate change and then from the violence that results from the strains to government caused by climate change. I do think that direct investment and aid will help the situation. The barrier always with providing aid to some of these countries is the rank corruption that characterizes their bureaucracies. And so you have to figure out a good and efficient way of getting resources to the people at the bottom who need it rather than feathering the pockets of the officials that filter it down to them. And that's a hard thing to do.
Okay.
Let me try a couple of questions here. There are a couple of questions about Honduras and how the U.S. has dealt with the situation with the Honduran president there. And VP Harris is leading a diplomatic approach to Central American governments. And due to meet with these leaders, can the sentencing of Tony Hernandez, what will that have? What effect will that have on the negotiations? And there's also one other follow-up question, if you can remember it, about how the Europeans and others how they're managing the refugee crisis in the Middle East. Should we follow that model with respect to the Central Americans?
Well, the Europeans aren't handling it that well.
Yeah.
They tried to prevent things from happening, and then the dam burst in 1 year in 2015, and they had 1 million entries. And I got a lot of respect for Angela Merkel. She bit the bullet and took them in and said, we've got to do this. But the rest of the European Union wasn't ready for it, especially the newer countries. The numbers are not that great. The European Union is a very wealthy place and a very big place. And a lot of the people that were coming, at least from the data that I've seen, are basically middle-class teachers, service workers, some professionals, officials, and they're not poor workers. And actually, Europe needs labor because it's an aging society, and its labor force growth is negative in many cases. So it was a political disaster in Europe for it to take in 1 million people in 1 year. The United States takes in 1 million people every year. It's just what we do, and that doesn't cause any perturbations. So it's a matter of your perspective. If we took in all the Central Americans, we're not going to increase the 1 million to 2 million. It's going to be 1.1 or 1.2 million, maybe for a time, and then it'll go back down. No, I don't take the European Union as a model at all. It's very fragmented, and a lot of the countries just are not prepared to accept the fact that they're going to be a country of immigration.
Although there is one similarity, the Europeans paid the Turks to stop.
Yeah, well, we both like to outsource our dirty work. So we've outsourced it to Amlo, and they've outsourced it to Erdogan.
Okay. What about Honduras?
Honduras has a long history with the United Fruit Company and American corporations paying off an elite to get their way. And it's been a very poor country and not very well run. There were political mobilizations against the ruling elite. And I think they probably won this presidential election some years ago. But they pulled the plug on it and pretended like they couldn't count the votes, and then they miraculously came up with votes that showed the ruling party's president would stay in office or come into office. And the US didn't really do anything. We didn't protest it. We didn't say this is not a good idea. We didn't impose any costs. And the population had really mobilized in support of this. And then when the US didn't do anything to support the democracy movement, and in fact accepted the reimposition of a dictatorship, it was very disarming to a lot of people. And they started to look for other options to deal with it rather than politically transforming the country. It became easier to leave for someplace better.
Caroline, you want to ask a few more?
Well, let's see. I've got one. Whoops, keeps moving on me. Aren't both parties taking advantage of legitimate refugees to obtain the immigration policies that they want? Aren't both parties really intentionally confusing the issues rather than address what immigration is for most people, the opportunity for a better life?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Politicians, I've been working in public policy and immigration for 40 years. And one thing I've learned is that when legislators sit down and think about what do we want to do with immigration, not thinking about what is immigration, how can we manage it to the benefit of both countries, but thinking, how is this going to affect me politically? And how can I capitalize on this politically? And that mindset sets in motion things that often don't work very well. The militarization of the border is a good example. I testified before Congress numerous times that the massive increase in border enforcement was counterproductive because it was deterring people from going home and stopping a circular flow and turning it into a settled population. But they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah. There was also a question about the proportion of migrants fleeing from South America, in particular Venezuela. How do they come into the mix, whether you've focused on them at all?
Venezuela is the poster case for a state failure in the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a real talent to take a country with the largest proven reserves of oil and turn it into an economic basket case in 10 years, but Chavistas managed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a failing state. And it took Mexico 50 years for 10% of its population to end up living in the United States. It took 5 years for Venezuela for that to happen. It's still ongoing. From our point of view, we're probably going to benefit from it because it was a wealthy society and had a lot of resources and a lot of educated people. And those people are the ones that are coming to the United States. So the fastest growth of any segment of the undocumented population from 2010 to 2018 was Venezuelans, but they don't cross the border.
Yeah.
They come in on tourist visas or work visas or other kinds of visas. They've got connections in Miami, they got connections in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're getting are skilled and educated workers. And Mr. Biden, soon after assuming office, announced that the people that were here without overstaying their visas and out of status were going to get TPS, temporary protected status,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably a smart way to do it. They've got family members here, they've got skills, and they integrate pretty quickly and readily into the U.S. economy and provide value. The lower classes tend to scatter throughout Latin America, particularly South America. So there's Venezuelans. Colombia just bit the bullet and announced that the million or so Venezuelans in Colombia can stay in a temporary legal status, which is, I think, the sensible thing to do. It'll cause fewer problems in the longer term to accept the reality rather than to try to suppress it. That usually backfires. And they're going into Brazil, they're going into Peru, Ecuador, Chile, making their way into Panama, which used to be part of Colombia. But they're not really crossing the so-called Northern Triangle and trying to enter Mexico and crossing the border. You don't find very many on the border. It's heavily dominated by Central Americans and Haitians. There's a lot of Haitians just south of the border as well.
What is Mexico doing to control its southern border? This is one of the questions.
Well, it's Amlo's taken a hard line, and they've always provided some enforcement on the southern border. But he's mobilized a new element, the Guardia Nacional or something like that. I forget what it's called. But it's like a paramilitary force that's supposed to patrol immigrants in the country, and they're taking a harder line at the border, and they're harassing people on the trip northward, and they're harassing people in the camps in northern Mexico. So they're certainly not encouraging migrants at all. But Mexico is kind of between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, they don't want to anger the United States. On the other hand, they've become an aging society, and they have labor needs that aren't being satisfied, especially in rural areas. And a lot of these Central Americans are actually working in the agrarian sector in Mexico now. So immigration always gives you instances of strange bedfellows.
And let me just quickly, and then we'll go back, let Caroline pick up some more of the questions, but the Central American Minors Program was created in 2014. And basically it's a program to try to process the kids and the family members there in Central America before they cross. I don't know what happened to that program. I would assume that it was abandoned maybe by the Trump administration, but if it was 2014, then it was set up in the Obama administration. So that's the question about this seat.
Yeah, well, the fact that I didn't know about it, I think indicates that it didn't do very well. I vaguely recollect it now. I think it was working, but it wasn't working very effectively. And I'm not sure what, there's be somebody's PhD dissertation to do a story, to do an analysis of what happened with that program. But certainly it was ignored totally during the Trump administration. Their whole policy was set by Stephen Miller, not the head of the band from the 60s. He's really a hardliner, and he lives to suppress immigrants and to keep them from coming into the country. That's his whole identity, and he, he admits it. He was very sad that he had to leave the office. He didn't know what he was going to do when he couldn't prosecute immigrants anymore.
Caroline, we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I'm going to combine the last two that I see. One, because I think they sort of related, or they could be. One person asks if humanitarian migration can be influenced by presidential priorities. Is it possible to build a bureaucratic mechanism to insulate the asylum process from such ideological swings? Then the other question is the comment that we hear a lot of the time about admitting people who are, like, legalizing 11 million undocumented people who've been living in this country for 20 years, and the why can't they stand in line kind of argument. But people who abide by the law and follow the legal immigration system, waiting until a visa becomes available. How is, in light of these more humanitarian migrants that we're now dealing with at the border, how do you balance that concern that we hear vocalized against what's the reality on the border?
Well, the reality is always very messy. And you talk about people standing in line. It was very common to bring up Abuelita, and she would live and take care of the kids in Houston. And then you would file for her legal entry. She'd wait in line while she was in Houston. Then the papers would come through. They would go back to Mexico, and she'd collect them and come in. Things are very messy, and they're not so ordered. And I think at some point you just have to realize that this population is here permanently. It's got deep roots. It's got U.S.-born kids, and the cost to us of deporting them all is just not worth it. If you want to, you could at the same time you give a pathway to legalization, you could temporarily expand the quotas to allow a lot of the backlogs to clear, so you're not punishing people who, quote, waited in line. But a lot of people talk about, my grandparents came in and they didn't come in illegally. Well, there's no numerical limit on immigration until 1921. And right. then there was no numerical limit on immigration from the Western Hemisphere until 1968. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people came in and they came in legally because there was no blockage for them getting here.
And what about the other question, which was about protecting the asylum system from the vagaries of, shifting governments and political ideology?
That's really hard without legislation. if you can get the legislation passed to do it, then you've got a foundation. But we've seen what happens with executive orders. You can change. They can change from administration to administration. So we had DACA, and then we had the rescission of DACA, and it puts people in a very vulnerable position. And so it would require legislation to be passed to create a structure that would insulate the asylum process from the political vagaries of the United States. But Congress hasn't passed a major piece of immigration legislation since 1990. And
well, I think we have been, thanks to you for being so incredibly disciplined. It's very rare for a professor to keep their remarks so tight. And this has given us a chance to have a really expansive conversation with a lot of people here in North Texas. And, there may be other questions on the table that we're not going to be able to get to. But this has been really informative. I think it's a perfect example of the kind of things that we can do in the university to open up and have these kind of conversations with a much broader segment of the community. Caroline, do you want to say any final things before we let Bort close? Thank
you to everybody for attending and giving us some good questions. This is in the nature of the Visiting Scholars Program of Phi Beta Kappa, to have an intellectual conversation and to come out of it better informed. And thank you, Professor Massey, for. We're sad we can't have you here in person, but this is second best.
Yeah, we were going to have some beer and shots of tequila, but that will be for next time.
Well, I'm of the opinion my colleagues in the academy, they talk too much. So I try to keep my remarks simple and direct and to the point. And I would rather have left the session tonight and joined you for wine and cheese somewhere than signing off on Zoom.
Okay.
Perfect. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And again, thank you to our partners, the Phi Beta Kappa Gamma of Texas at SMU, the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, and Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center. And thank you, Doug. This was great, so informative, and we hope to see you soon when everything opens up. We'll bring you back at SMU.
We have our workshop tomorrow, so we'll see.
Yes, and we'll see you tomorrow at noon.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Doug.
Have a great afternoon.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.